Hi everyone, my name is Carolina Becerril. I'm a senior studying health science in the 4+1 BSMPH program. My advisor is Dr. Paula Quattromoni, and my study is on social media use and eating disorder risk among college students. So first, just a quick overview of my presentation and a little bit of a trigger warning. I will be speaking about eating disorders, so if that's something that triggers you and you want to walk out, that's fine. I will be talking about social media use and eating disorder risk and why we chose college students specifically, eating competence and body appreciation, methods, results, strengths and limitations, and conclusions. So with outside stressors like moving away and transitioning from late teenage years to young adulthood, college students are at significant risk of developing an eating disorder. As a matter of fact, the Healthy Mind study found that 11% showed an elevated risk, 30% engaged in purging, and 40% engaged in binging in a sample of 9,000 students. Most notably, social media use has been explored in relation to eating disorder risk, and a consistent association has been found between social media use, eating disorder risk, disorder eating, and body dissatisfaction among college students. So clearly, the risk and evidence is there. However, most literature continues to focus only on female college students and one or two social media platforms, which is why we set out to recruit a more diverse representative sample. However, what makes our study a lot more different is that we've decided to focus on two novel adaptive skills, eating competence and body appreciation. A competent eater is someone who is positive, reliable, and flexible when it comes to eating, which is vastly different from an eating disorder. And body appreciation is essentially the opposite of body dissatisfaction, which is a common eating disorder symptom. And we decided to focus on these skills because a lot of the literature right now focuses on disorder eating and body dissatisfaction, two very important risk factors that often have to be reduced when evaluating this relationship, whereas eating competence and body appreciation can instead be built up and even act as protective factors. With that said, we started a pilot study in the summer of 2021. We then expanded to 5 other schools across Massachusetts in September, where we recruited students via social media and Dean of Students' offices. Participants then completed their survey. In December, when the study closed, we then mailed the gift cards, and now we're in the analysis and writing phase, hoping to get published. Like I mentioned, participants filled out a survey of 78 questions, where they first started with the eligibility criteria, moved on to the informed consent section, the descriptive questions, which just gathered demographic data. We then moved on to the social media use assessment, and then we then evaluated the 3 outcomes in the order of eating competence, eating disorder risk, and body appreciation, and they then filled out a raffle form if they were interested in winning a $25 Starbucks gift card. For analysis, we decided to generate descriptive statistics about our study, as well as to run multivariate regressions. We also generated univariate regressions to assess any differences among demographic and outcome variables across all social media exposure groups. And finally, we ran a certification and alteration model to further evaluate the relationship between social media use and eating disorder risk. As you can see in my table here, you'll see that our sample was composed of 334 college students. You will note that statistically significant differences across social media use groups will be bolded, and those factors that are considered protective are labeled in green, and those that are considered risky are labeled in red. As you can see, about half of our sample reported using social media for about 1 hour a day, and smaller proportions reported higher use of social media. Our sample was also evenly divided between male and female correspondents, with female respondents more likely to use social media than male respondents. And the same thing can be said about white students as compared to other racial groups. Similarly, students with disabilities and international students reported using social media more as compared to other frequencies, whereas the opposite effect can be observed among first-generation college students. And something that I also think is important to note is that our sample was evenly divided between respondents of private and public schools. And most notably, the burden of eating disorder diagnosis and eating and body image concerns among our study was remarkably high, with more than half of our sample reporting an eating disorder diagnosis and more than 70% reporting body and eating concerns. And as we can see, the use of social media varies among these groups, with higher percentages at the end of both spectrums. We then move on to our outcome variables, where we can observe vastly interesting findings. Eating competence among our sample was remarkably low, with a median score of 21, and for reference, a competent eater, which we defined earlier, would score typically at 32 or above. So clearly, we're at very, very low levels right now. And those with lower social media use had the lowest eating competence scores, and similar patterns can be observed among the subscales. Similarly, we can observe that body appreciation scores were extremely low in our population, falling well below 20 points, a maximum score of 65. And finally, eating disorder risk was remarkably high in our population, especially among those using social media for lesser amounts of times. And for reference, someone who's considered to be at a high risk for an eating disorder would typically score a 20 or above or answer yes to the behavioral questions of the assessment. And this is where we can see that we had really high percentages of students having to be referred for further evaluation of an eating disorder. Finally, we move on to the regression results, where we find that there was no statistically significant association between social media use and eating competence, although among white and first-generation students, they showed an inverse and statistical significant association. Similarly, there was also no association between social media use and body appreciation, although, again, white students showed an inverse and statistically significant association. And something that was very interesting, that is contrary to our hypothesis, eating disorder risk had a statistically significant and inverse association with social media use in the overall population. And we purposely say in the overall population because once we ran the stratified model, we realized that eating disorder diagnosis was an effect modifier, meaning that the relationship between social media use and eating disorder risk was different among subgroups. So eating disorder risk increased as social media use decreased among those without an eating disorder diagnosis, and eating disorder risk scores trended higher among higher users of social media in the subgroup of those with an eating disorder diagnosis. And for our odds ratio model, we found that the odds of needing a referral for further evaluation increased as social media use decreased, and these were particularly high among white and first-generation students. Now we move on to our strengths and limitations. So the strength was that our sample was evenly divided between male and female correspondents. However, we do want to acknowledge that obviously they're not the only people that can suffer from eating disorders, or that they are at a really high risk, and they're not representative of everyone. But compared to other studies, it's a pretty cool thing to do in our study. And we also were inclusive of underrepresented groups, particularly first-generation international students, and we also explored novel adaptive skills. Some limitations, however, were the cross-sectional study design. Our social media and outcomes were self-reported, and we didn't assess any other mental health disorders that could have potentially affected the relationship, and there's always a potential for sampling bias because of our recruitment methods. Finally, we conclude that the relationship between social media use, eating disorder risk, eating competence, and body appreciation among college students is rather complex, and deserves further exploration through prospective and qualitative studies. The remarkable levels of body appreciation and eating competence are very, very low and can serve as intervention targets for health promotion, including among first-generation students for a starting point. Our study confirmed the high burden of eating disorder risk in the college population and is deserving education and mental health services, and we hope that it continues to be explored. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation and super interesting. One question, I'm curious, for further research, if the study were to be done again or similar sort of hypotheses explored, do you think it would have made a difference to ask those who engage in social media use maybe what their top few like hashtags were or what kind of content they most typically consume, especially because there may be a lot of content on social media that could fuel sort of self-consciousness or improper or unhealthy eating behavior, but there's also sort of a lot of body positivity. So I'm curious if you think that plays a role.
Yeah, 100%. That's something that we were talking about, especially when it came to future direction, because obviously our findings were rather different. And that's something that we were discussing, how people engage with social media and what it is that we come across. Particularly, there's these movements called Fitspiration and Thinspiration that focus a lot on like fitness advice and how to lose weight quickly, which is obviously can be very harmful. So yeah, I definitely think that's always something good to keep in mind as we move forward, because again, the things that you see and the way that you engage can definitely affect this relationship. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was really interesting. I was just wondering about the third point you made about strength. You talked about the adaptive, some kind of adaptive things, behaviors people were doing. If you could say a little bit more about that, like what you found.
Yeah, so when it came to the outcomes, particularly eating competence and body appreciation, so we found that, like I mentioned, someone who's a competent eater, essentially someone who's positive in mindset when it comes to eating, like they're okay with trying new foods, like going out of their comfort zone, and they don't, for lack of a better word or term, they don't get in their heads too much about it, right? So again, we found that that skill particularly was very low among college students, which means that we really need to focus on educating and sort of normalizing eating foods that are not labeled as like healthy or like unhealthy. So vocabulary is also very important. And when it comes to body appreciation, like a lot of the questions that are in the assessment are like, I feel good about myself all the time. I don't compare myself with X, Y, and Z. And again, that was also remarkably low. Like it was more than 20 points against, when it comes to the maximum scores. So I think like we decided to explore these skills because we realized that a lot of the time we focus on like the negative risk factors, which are obviously very important, but focusing on these two novel skills are, one, they're very different and they're very new. And it's also something that we could potentially, instead of having to reduce like the negative mindsets, we can build up the positive mindsets, encourage people to be more positive about eating and themselves and really engage in healthy practices when it comes to their mind and body.
Kind of going off of that, are there any existing like educational models to increase these skills, or is this something that's really new in the research?
So I personally haven't done much research when it comes to interventions. I was mostly focused on sort of what the pre-existing relationship is. Unfortunately, when it comes to eating competence and body appreciation, there is some research out there, but it's mainly focused on more, the older adult population rather than college students, which is why we decided to sort of focus here now, because right now that we know of, there are not many interventions that particularly focus on eating competence and body appreciation. There's a lot focused on eating disorder risk, but even then, those that focus on social media literacy, which addresses that relationship between social media use and ED risk, again, it's just very limited.
So picking up on that, what would be your dream next study to do? You know, would you want to look at the population that comes right before this, in age, right? So late high school, and then see how it evolves in time? Or, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of data here, but as the questions are showing, there's so many more raised.
Yeah. I mean, I think it definitely could be a good starting point because, like I mentioned, like that transition and that sort of like pressure can definitely play a big part in the relationship. I think for me personally, like a dream next step would be to assess the relationship more in a qualitative stance. Like I would be very interested to see how people engage and how looking at that kind of content really plays into this relationship.
And then just one more quick question. Were the participants aware of this, the results? Did they get their own, say, scores back?
No, they didn't. They didn't get to see whatever scores they got. We were the only ones that were able to see the results.
Any more questions for Carolina? All right. If not, please join me in thanking her again for a great talk.
Thank you.